Okay, this is a walkthrough of the Android SDK platform, and in particular using Android SDK with the book Big Nerd Ranch's Android Programming. To get started with, you need the Android SDK, which you can find at this URL or just by Googling it. You can either download the Eclipse Android Developer Toolkit, which gives you everything in one package, or you will have to go to down here under View All Downloads and Sizes, and you can get it here. I think this one's an installer, and I think these are just zip files. I'm not exactly sure on that, but possibly. And then right here, if you just want the SDK tools, you can get that there. In my case, that's what I did. I downloaded the SDK tools separate from the Android, from Eclipse or any other sort of particular package. And the reason I did that is because if I open up Android Studio right now, I am able to reference the same SDK without having to download multiple files over and over again. And it is an incredible amount of downloads in order to get up and running with Android development. So that's the first thing you have to do. The second thing is you need Java. So you must have the Java SDK, right? And you can get that from Oracle's website. And here you have the JDK. That's the Java Developer Toolkit. And you click on that, and then you accept the license agreement. You will have to sign up for an Oracle account, I believe. And then you get the JDK for your particular system. You might have to go into, so whenever I right click here and I go into Control Panel, you might have to go to your environment and edit your system environment, and the thing you're going to need is this Java home, which is going to point to where that file is being referenced, and that's that way Android Studio or Eclipse will know what it's looking for. You can specify that on a project setting or other ways, but that is the environment variable that does that. Next up, you have to download an incredible amount of SDKs, and actually I already have this thing running, so I'm going to run two of them, but it's this guy. Now I downloaded everything. You don't need all that much, but the SDK tools and platform tools, you're going to need those. And then as you scroll down here, it gives you the different APIs. API 5.0, you don't need this, but what is important to understand is that when you look at these system images, this is for the emulator. And whenever you hover over it, it tells you what SDK platform you're going to need in order to get that up and running. So there's the SDK platform. You need that. Each of these system images corresponds to a particular device. So the Intel x86 Atom 64 is for 64-bit emulators that use the phone or tablet. The TV ones are for emulating a TV. And then other ones are wearables, and you have to be very careful about selecting wearable as your compiler, because if you do, then a lot of the phone features simply will not work. Now, I downloaded everything, and you don't need the samples or a lot of that other stuff, but I downloaded everything up to API 14, which is 4.0. Now, anything less than that, you're not going to need. And I also downloaded the support repo and the support library and the Haxum emulator and a few other things. Now, the default emulator in Android is absolutely atrocious. And in order to get a better one, Intel has something called Haxum, which is Hardware Accelerated Execution Manager, and this is an emulator that runs much faster because the ARM emulator is not really compatible with the average computer, which uses the Intel processor. And this gives you a more native emulator, and because that is greatly enhanced. Now there is one huge downside to it, or not really a huge downside, but there is one thing you have to do, and that is that you must have Intel virtualization technology available, which means your computer must allow virtualization in order to use it. And to enable virtualization, you must reboot your computer, you must start up your BIOS settings, and you must tell it specifically that you wish to enable virtualization. Some computers do not have the capability to enable virtualization, so on those computers they simply will not be able to use Haxum at all. But it does require some configuration of your BIOS. Now, as far as which version of Android you need, there's something called Semantic Versioning, and this is more or less a best practice. It is not always followed through, but basically every single system should have 3 numbers. The first one is the major version. And whenever you make a change that will render something incompatible with previous versions, then you update that version number. Next up, you have the minor version, and that's where you add functionality, but it must be backwards compatible with older versions of the major change. And then finally, there is the patch version, and that is simply bug fixes. So updating a patch version should never break anything. Updating a minor version should never break anything, but updating a major version should break everything if you're following this sort of convention. And Android should be. Now, what that means is that when we look at the different APIs, for example, Android 4.0 is API 14, but 4.0.3 is API 15. And if I'm correct in this semantic versioning, at API 15 and 14, there should be problems with this one. This one should be bad in some particular way, which this one fixes, but doesn't add any new features. And if you open up Android Studio, it will start you off with API 15 by default, which to me is a much more sane starting point than what's going to happen when we do this in Eclipse. So you need all the tools for every single thing you're going to compile. These are your compilers basically, and then these are your platform tools that enable it to be previewed inside of your Eclipse window. So once you have all that up and running, the first thing you do is you say File, New, and you open a new Android application project. If it's not available to you, click Other, and you should see this Android folder, or you can just type in Android right here on the command line, and you will get your Android activity. Now, one other setting you're going to need to change is you go to Window, and you go to, I believe, Preferences. Let me make sure. Yep. And under Text Editors, under General, you enable line numbers. And that is very, very important because when it gives you error messages or when it tells you insert on this line, if you cannot see your line numbers, excuse me, right here, then you are going to have serious trouble following a lot of examples or doing anything useful with the debugging messages. That to me should be a default in every single project that that line numbers are visible, because they are so useful. But in some cases that is not true. So next up, once you have all that enabled, to actually run something, which we're not going to do just yet, but just to show you how things run, you can either create or edit a device. And when you create a new emulator device, you have to give it a name, and then you say what sort of device it should emulate, and that's going to come from which images you've installed, and then you tell it what API level it should be supporting. And again, you really don't want to drop any lower than Android 4.0.3. And then once you choose your emulator, you then choose the CPU. And if you have Intel x86 installed, you can use that, or you can use the default ARM. Now, it will let you choose Intel x86 even if you can't actually do anything with it, which can be a bit of a problem, because you'll boot it up and it'll tell you that something is wrong or that it's not able to do it. So once you have that, you can also click over here, and then you can see sort of these clone devices if you want to have a default emulator already available to you without all the configuration problems. So in the Big Nerd Ranch book, this is a great book, and the first thing is they give you some things about their code style and their conventions, and the most important thing is this little section right here, whereupon they show you that in this convention that whenever they make a change, anything that is being bolded is changed. If it has a line through it, that is something they are removing, and anything that is added like this is something they are adding, and here's where they're doing it at. And then it goes through that. Now the first thing they do is they show you what your default application should look like. Now, this is where I think things are very stupid. So we go to File, we go to New, and we go to New Android Project Manager. And now we'll call this Bad Idea from .NET. BR Web Design is mine. And for the target SDK, make sure you're not choosing one of the wearables, because that's for Android devices like that. And I'll choose 4.4 API 19 and compile with the latest SDK. So to run you through these settings really quick, this one is the bad setting to me. And the reason why I consider it such a terrible setting is because this is going to import all sorts of things into your project in order to support old APIs. Because remember, 2.0 and 4.4 have gone through at least 2 major version changes, plus a lot of extra stuff added in the minor version upgrades. So these two SDKs are completely incompatible. And so what's going to happen whenever I create this, and it doesn't like this naming convention because it's going to probably tell me that I need to do it like that, is that when I click next, and I can create a custom launcher if I want, and you can either choose their default little image, or you can go into clip art and choose one of the little clip arts that come with it, and you can edit that and play with that to your heart's content. Or you can use a little clip art version of their mascot. So you click next, and then you create an activity, and it's a blank activity. Now again, this is just a bad idea, so I'm not going to finish, or I'm going to finish this, but I'm going to immediately delete this once I'm done. So I create my terrible idea, fill to load properties file. Give it a second. Sometimes you get error messages inside of Android that are not real error messages, and this can happen for a number of reasons. One of the most common one is obsolete references or old files kind of hanging around that don't need to be there anymore. And as you can see, it takes it quite a bit of time in order to get through all this default configuration. And once it does, here's where things go wrong. Adding support libraries. And what happens when you make these sort of minimum SDKs with an old SDK version is you're going to get this file right here. And this can cause a lot of things to go wrong if you have not correctly configured everything inside the SDK downloads, where you download all the different support libraries. And the most obvious side effect of all of this is that if I go into here and I go to my activity main, excuse me, not there, res, assets, bin, and you'll see here's the Android support libraries, and then also there is this app compat where it also generates support libraries that it references. It'll take me a second to find it. Yeah, here we go. Is that the theme that you're going to get right here, and this causes a lot of problems if you do not have it installed. It's called theme.appcompat.lite. Now what that means is that prior to SDK version 14, it did not support default Android themes. It does now, but it didn't back then. So it has to reference this app compat for the theme in order to turn it to that Halo Light style. And you can delete errors if they're not actually critical, because a lot of these are garbage. And if you do have a lot of errors when you first open, like if you worked on a file and everything was fine, you open it up again and things are kind of looking weird, then you can clean out your project, and that'll have it remake some of these files, and you just saw it do it right there. And that can help clean out some of your problems. So this will work if everything is installed that you need installed to maintain backwards compatibility. But to me, if you're just starting out, you don't want to be worrying about these sorts of problems, right? You don't want to make things even harder than they were originally. And now everything's going to break because now this res file is referencing a styles, which is this theme.appcompat.lite, which it cannot find because I just deleted that out of there. And so now I have a breaking change. So to me, all this is just bad stuff. And so I'm going to completely remove all this stuff. A new Android project. This time it will be GeoQuiz, which is from the Big Nerd Ranch book. The package name I'm going to set to .NET BR Web Design, which is my URL, brwebdesign.net. But for the minimum, I will set this up to API 15 with a target SDK of API 19, but I'm going to compile it with the most recent API available to me. I'll click next, go to clip art. I will choose that little, maybe that. It doesn't really matter. And then create a new blank activity. Now in the book it changes this activity main. I'm going to leave it wrong because I want to demonstrate some errors that you might run across. And I'm going to dock some of the stuff because I don't really need it right now. And this is the default Android application you always are going to get when you create a new blank project, and it's just the hello world string right here. Now if I go into my values for styles again and I look at it, now I'm actually using the Android theme rather than the app compat ones. So now I'm able to natively use it without having to worry about the app compat and having everything configured correctly in order to make this work. So in the book, the first thing it does, and here it shows you the walkthrough of the files, and also I used a different naming convention, so I'm going to have to be aware of that. And here's where it tells you to change the default activity name, because otherwise you're going to get some problems, and that's perfectly okay with me. And then it shows you what the default looks like. These are all XML based build files, so if you know XML, and it's pretty easy to know how to do XML if you don't, it basically just means either if a element has children, then you don't close it out. So in this case, this relative layout has one child, the text view, and so then it closes out on its own separate line. However, if a element has no children, then you self-close it, which is what this backslash here means. Now it tells you that the XML version 1.0 is something you may find, and that it's not strictly speaking necessary, but you will still see it in many cases. And a relative layout, what that actually means is that when I grab and drag things, do you see how it's changing the margins and it says align to parent and all this other stuff? That's what relative means. It means I position this relative to other elements on the page. And every time I change it, it's going to then update the margins and some of the other settings based upon how that works. Let me do that. So align parent is true, and a few other things, and if I pop open the margins, you can see that it's set to 17 dp and 18 dp from the left and from the top, and the little arrows are indicating how that alignment works. So the relative layout is useful in some cases if you just need to do a quick and dirty lining up, but if you want a more precise measurement system, then you have to switch the default layout. So it shows you that what they're going to be using is a linear vertical layout, which is going to drop everything centered going up. It's going to keep centering out the space, and then a linear layout horizontal is going to make sure that everything is centered out vertically in the layout. And so here we come across our first convention of striking through code and then adding in some code. Now I'm not actually going to do quite all of that. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click on relative layout, and it has change layout, and I'm going to put this to a linear vertical layout, and then it's showing me where it's going to make those changes when I click preview, and that's okay with me. Now the only downside to this is that I will then need to remove some of those settings in order to get this correct. Once I do that, the next piece is to add in these text views and to put them into their own version of a linear layout. So I'm going to copy that to my clipboard, and then I'm going to go to the activity main XML, which actually is already open, and you can see here how all this stuff works. I will need to add in one extra feature that is missing whenever you do this sort of layout, and that is I need the gravity setting, and I think they send it to center, perhaps? Yes, center, which should center everything. And then after that, I'm going to need to paste in the text view and the linear layout. Now, this is something you don't have to do, but I prefer to write my code like this so that the closing tag can be seen and that every element that is nested can be seen from the hierarchical layout. So there's a text view, it self-closes out, and then I have a linear layout, and inside of the linear layout I have a button that self-closes. So I'm going to put that over by 2, and then finally and indent these as well, and then finally I have another button over here which I'm also going to indent, put that on its own line, and then do it like that. Now, the reason why I do it like this is because it just makes it clear to me whether a tag is self-closing, whether it has children, things like that. And then here's my two linear layouts, and that makes sure that everything is properly closed out. Now, I should be getting problems with this. This one right here, these little warnings, is just because it's telling me that this is not the best way to do this. It's telling me that I actually should be adding a button bar style on the parent container, which is going to be this linear layout. Now, the only downside to this little help thing right here is it doesn't give me the typical easy way of fixing this, which we'll look at in a bit. But for right now, I'm just going to ignore that. It should be throwing errors because I actually shouldn't have a string called true button and a string called false button. Those should not yet exist, and those are found underneath string. What I do have is my app name, which is GeoQuiz. I have the hello world string, and I have the action setting string. Now, if I delete the hello world string, let me save this actually. If you see a little asterisk or splat there, it means you haven't saved your changes. And if I switch back to my graphical layout, you can see here that here's where I have errors, and that's what I'm expecting because I don't have a string called question text or true button or false button, so it cannot resolve those, so it's just giving me this little error down here, and that's perfectly fine for right now. Here it shows you how the view hierarchy lays out. This linear layout has two children or two subclasses. This is the superclass and subclass to use the correct Java terminology, although I think XML calls them parent-children relationships, parent element and child elements. So there's that. But so it has one direct child, and then this linear layout over here has two children as well, and that's where it terminates. And then it's telling you that match parent means that the view will be as big as its parent, and wrap content means it will be as big as the content itself requires. So in the match parent, the parent is this entire screen minus 16 dp. And that comes because, as you can see here, there is these defaults dimensions for activity horizontal margin, and let me look at it, and it's 16 dp. dp stands for density independent pixels. Yeah, it says it right here. And what that means is that as you switch devices, they measure pixels differently. They have a different pixel density ratio. Yes, now I'm getting my good errors. That's the good stuff. So because of that, you need a device-independent way of calculating pixels so that the same layout does not radically change whenever you switch devices. Otherwise, if you have 18 hard-coded pixels on a low-density device, so here you can see the different device, like a low DPI device, these would be pushed very far in, but on a high-density device, 16 pixels doesn't mean much. They would be all the way over here. So by having a density-independent pixel ratio, we can make sure that our apps look the same on different devices, or at least roughly the same. There are still certain considerations that have to go into effect. Then we get into orientation, and that's just warning you that right here we have our set vertical or set horizontal orientation, and that things are going to flip dramatically whenever we do that. And so the first thing it's telling you to do is to create 3 new strings in bold, which gives you the question text, the true button, and the false button. Now you can either do it like that, or inside it here you can click add, tell it you want to add a new string, and you can give it its name. In this case the name is question text, and then the actual value of it is Constantinople is the largest city in Turkey. Like that. That will work. And make sure you're always saving your changes, and then it updates. Or you can click the strings.xml file and you can copy and paste them directly in, like so. Either way works as long as these values are actually all the same, but this is much quicker if you're copying and pasting things in versus setting them up yourself. So that's how the book does it. And then we get our preview, and that just means that if we attempt to go to activity main.xml, it should be very similar to that, and we can see that they pretty much match up. Then it describes inflating different methods inside of the Android SDK, and then it talks about resource files, and the resource files are underneath, or not resource, but the resource IDs are under src, whatever your package name is. There's that, and then there's these generated files, and the r.java one is the one that's being built for us. And it warns you that this is auto-generated, don't modify. And what it's doing is setting all these different resources to an integer value using, I want to say hexadecimal. That's what this looks like. So it's using hexadecimal to set up these different themes. And then if we were to change certain things, then they would be reflected inside of here as we did our updates. So inside of there, our next task is to actually add IDs to our buttons, and there are two ways of doing that. One is you can click on it, and you'll see that right here we have this ID setting available to us, and we can set it up right there, or we can do it directly in there, and that's @+ID / what do they name it? True button. And then it's going to ask one to update everything that references it, and I'll say yes. And now I have a programmatic way of getting it, and you'll also notice that up here I now have a named value for it. You can name everything, so if you didn't just want linear layout to be called linear layout, you could change that one, or you could change the ID of the text view if you wanted to programmatically change it, and so forth and so on. The @+ means to create a new resource ID for that particular file. So you save that. If I go inside of there, and I look for my true button, that now exists. I now have an ID that references this particular true button. And there it is again, but this is the string class, so I have hello world, I have question text and false button, but before, whenever I was just looking at the true button, I only have that ID, so I can only programmatically manipulate this particular true button. So I have to do the same thing with this guy, so it's the same exact step, @+ID / false button, make the change, save it, and then this gets updated. Now alternatively, I could go back into the activity main XML and I could put it there, but you're going to see that the actual values for the IDs should be identical, and they are. And then it tells you that this creates those new resource IDs so that you can programmatically manipulate things. The next thing you're going to do is you're going to set up two private button variables, and you're going to be doing that inside the actual Java file. And so here we're getting some errors. Blah, 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 R cannot be resolved to a variable. That's fine for now. We will be handling that in a minute. Now, the first thing that happens whenever I paste this in is I get error messages, as I should. And the reason why is it says button cannot be resolved to a type. It means that I have not yet imported that into the space. So it doesn't know what I'm referring to when I say create a new button. To get it to resolve correctly, if you hit Control-Shift-O, it's going to organize your imports, and then that's going to bring in the Android.widget.button package into there. I still have some errors, and that's going to be, it can resolve it to a type. It's lying right now on that error, but the value is not being used. So even though I've declared that there will be a button, I'm not actually using it or doing anything with it just yet. Next, we have main activity extends activity. So the way Java works is that every cuts F2 would focus in on it. And you should actually, or you can click on it and that'll bring its focus. It'll tell you what methods are available to you, how they all work, and you can go through and find out more information about it. And this shows you what the activity lifecycle is. Next we have @override, and this is a compiler directive, so I can actually remove this and nothing bad will happen. But what @override does is it makes sure that I actually am overriding what this activity is extending. So I'm saying go to the superclass, make sure it has an onCreate method, because if I did that, which Java is case sensitive, I get an error now. So this @override is making sure that I actually am overriding what I think I'm overriding. And then I'm going to pass in the bundle, and then I'm going to tell it that call the activities.onCreate method and pass it this saved instance state. And then in addition to that, I'm going to set a new content view as the default whenever it loads up, and that is this activity main XML file. So next, inside the onCreate method, I'm going to actually call these two new buttons, or rather I'm going to initialize them. So here they've been declared, but now I'm actually going to, initialize, but they have not been declared with a value yet. So I'm going to say that they are of the type button, and this is a typecasting to make sure that whatever this find view by ID returns is going to be typecast to a button and assigned to this value. And it's the resource.id of true button and false button. So now it expects that whenever it looks inside of here, it will actually have those two IDs. If I did not have those IDs set up, then it should throw an error saying it cannot find that. So now those are available to my system. Now I need an event listener. And the first event listener is going to be assigned right after the true button is created. Once again, I get errors, and these errors are because I do not have an event listener class and I do not have a view class. So I can either Control-Shift-O in order to manage my imports, or I should be able to go to, here it is, Organize Imports. Whenever I click that, either Control-Shift-O or right-click and go to Refactor and Organize Imports, it imports those classes as well, and so now those are available to me. So now it's happy. So what this does, it says whenever someone clicks on this button, then I want to create a new on-click listener, which doesn't do anything just yet. And the reason why it doesn't do anything, there we go, is because this is of type interface, and interface is just a contract, and the contract states that whatever I declare as an interface, I must implement the method of this particular name, and I must pass an argument of this particular type. Beyond that, it doesn't care. So even though I'm not actually doing anything, I do not have an error because I have successfully fulfilled the minimum definition of that contract. But if I do that, it should throw an error right now, and the error should be telling me that it is not fulfilling the contract correctly. And then I do that, and now I have fulfilled the minimal contract definition. Now, of course, this view V, I can name this whatever I want, views or whatever. This V is just a reference to a particular instance of the view object or view class, but it doesn't do anything just yet. Alright, and from there we do the exact same thing. It goes into a discussion of anonymous inner classes and how they work, and then we do the exact same thing with the false button. So right here, and just to make it line up a little bit better. Now what we can also do, or at least we should be able to do, is extract the method and call it on false click, make it protected, and what that does is that it takes that exact same code we would have executed, and now it pulls it into its own dedicated class. There are other ways of doing it. I did it this way right here, but I'm going to go ahead and use the default whenever I go to refactor and extract the method. Call this on true click. Now the reason why you would do that is because now the code is a little bit cleaner to read. If you put everything inline, sort of how the book does it, then it gives you a cluttered interface. And so now I have my own dedicated event listener set up, and it's got a name that tells me what actually happened. And I could call this on true click button. So if I right clicked it again and said refactor and rename, then it would look for places where I have that listed, and I could call it on true click button, on true button click rather, and it would rename that, and that would be even more clear of what's going on there. So refactor, rename, which is Alt-Shift-R, and on false button click, and then whenever I scroll down, that has already been updated. And right here when it says generate method comments, you can actually put in a little comment to yourself and say, you know, and that works just fine. So now we're going to use toast, and to do that, toast is a little quick pop-up box, sort of like an alert box in JavaScript, and what it does is that when we go to our strings.xml, which is right here, actually it's already loaded up, and we pass in these strings, it's going to call these methods, or excuse me, call these named parameters, and it's going to say correct or incorrect. Now I use strings XML files to make it easier to centrally update everything. It's just like using variables. It allows you to make a change that affects everything without having to go through and Control F and find and replace manually. And it also allows us to do things like internationalization or set up different messages for people who might be have a device accessibility enabled. So people who have some sort of disability, we can set in special parameters for them. So once we have that done, we're then going to create a toast method, and it explains that the toast make text requires a context, a resource ID, and a duration. And inside of our onClick method, we're going to add that. So if you didn't refactor, just paste it right in, but if you did refactor it, that belongs right here. And we're going to have two errors, one of which will be easy to fix, and the other one will require a little bit of understanding. And I want to show this error because it helps. So down here we have this method. So the first one is just this toast object does not exist, and it's telling me from my intelligence hint that I can just import that in, or once again Control-Shift-O is going to import that. But the next problem is that whenever it looks for the context, I'm telling it that this is quiz activity, but the actual context is main activity. So I'm going to pass in main activity right here and main activity right there, save it, and now those errors go away. And then it's looking for the resource.string of incorrect toast, and that's available right there. And actually that's truly available inside this r.java class. And then if I look for correct toast, I can see that's r.string correct toast, and that's what it's actually looking for. It's looking for this integer identifier. So now I have that. And the next step is to run an emulator. And in order to do that, I must be inside the activity main XML file in the graphical layout, and I still have some errors, or not errors, but rather warnings, where it's telling me I'm not following the particular best style that it thinks, but I'm going to ignore that for now. I'll click run, or run it as an Android application, and if nothing happens, there can be a couple of reasons for that. Usually, one of the downsides of many downsides is that it doesn't know what it should do whenever I say run, because it doesn't have a run configuration enabled. So if I double click on Android application under the run configurations, I can call this GeoQuiz. It's going to ask for what project. Since GeoQuiz is the only project available, I'll select that. I'll tell it to launch the default activity, and then I'm going to tell it that I want it to automatically pick the best one that it can. And I could set up some other parameters as well. And hopefully with that applied, it will actually now attempt to run this. And if I look at the details, I'll see if it gives me any errors whenever it tries to create this new Android virtual device. Alright, I paused it because these things take forever in order to load up, but if all went well, I get my toast message, it disappears, and whenever I say false, it gives me the correct it tells me that that is the correct answer. So that is GeoQuiz, and we've covered strings, we've covered resource IDs, we've covered a little bit of debugging, we've covered app compat, and a lot of other stuff. So hopefully this gives you a way of understanding how to get through this very simple project. But even though it's a very simple project, there is a lot of stuff going on under this hood that you have to understand in order to make it work correctly.